Hey, you guys, gals, and bums, and welcome back to A Few Bad Men. All right, today I'm going to be doing something a little different. I'm going to be talking about the Jewish mob, the Jewish Mafia, or the Kosher Nostra, as some call it. The organization of Jewish gangsters that operated alongside the Italian Cosa Nostra in the 1930s. So after years of studying these guys and reading newspapers and FBI files and seeing the same names arrested together in different combinations, I started to see the connections and realized that what was considered to be Murder Incorporated was really the Jewish mob, and its leader was Lepke Bokult. Now I'm going to show you how they all connected and worked together to control labor and narcotics in New York through murder and intimidation, and I'm going to show how the majority of the murders pinned on Murder Incorporated were committed to further the gang's interests or to protect Lepke from prosecution, and not so much used by the Cosa Nostra as their enforcement arm, although they did some of that too. Some of these stories I've told before, and I have videos on. I'll be putting the links to the videos up, and I'll be redoing the ones that got taken down over the next few weeks. All right, so let's get into this. So to understand the Jewish mob, we need to go back to the beginning. From 1820 to 1880, many German-speaking Jews immigrated to the United States seeking economic opportunities and religious freedoms. From the 1880s to the 1920s, a large wave of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, particularly Russia, arrived in the U.S., fleeing persecution and seeking a better life. Many of them settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. In 1900, New York City's Jewish population was estimated to be around 598,000, about 17% of the city's total population. Most of them lived on the Lower East Side or Williamsburg, Brooklyn. The majority of them were poor and lived in cramped and decrepit tenements. The children of these immigrants formed gangs to protect themselves against other gangs in the neighborhood, made up of Irish or Italian gangsters. These were gangs of tough guys who fought other gangs, strong armed people, ran pickpocketing rings, or had young ladies walking the streets. The first man to organize the Jewish street toughs of the Lower East Side was Monk Eastman. Edward Osterman, also known as William Delaney, but better known as Monk Eastman, was born in 1873 in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. At some time in his youth, he made his way over to the Lower East Side and took to the streets. Gangland at that time was all about brawling, and Monk quickly proved that he was very good with his hands, feet, a club, a knife, or a gun. The street fights of his youth were not documented, but his body and face told the whole story. He bore several knife and bullet scars on his body, and his nose had been broken so many times, it was just a lump of cartilage with holes in it that laid on his face. In 1901, he was shot at close range in the belly and once behind the ear after a dispute in the bar where he was the bouncer. He was taken to Gouverneur Hospital where he was not expected to live, but he pulled through and walked out a few weeks later. By the early 1900s, Monk had about 60 men who followed his commands. Their crimes were far from organized. They were basically strong-arm robbers, pickpockets, pimps, and whatever else they could get into. The Eastman gang, as it became known, were street brawlers at heart. They engaged in massive brawls and gun battles in the streets with other gangs that would sometimes last for days. The Eastmans clashed with other ethnic gangs in the area like the Irish Yakey Yakes and the Italian 5 Point Gang, led by Paul Kelly. Monk's power came from Tammany Hall. On election day, Monk could guarantee hundreds of voters to make the rounds repeat voting in different districts, and the muscle to make sure those who did vote honestly voted the right way or not at all. This political pull gave Monk the ability to kill, rob, and steal with impunity in New York. Whatever he did, the bosses of Tammany could fix it. Almost. In 1903, Eastman was arrested for trying to rob the son of a wealthy businessman by the Pinkerton detectives paid to keep the boy safe. He would be sentenced to 8 years. The next man to wear the crown was Max Zerback, known as Kid Twist or Kid Sly Fox, who took the game to the next level. Max was born in 1884 in Austria-Hungary and moved to New York when he was still a child. Under Zerback, the gang expanded into extorting local businesses, legal and illegal. Every legal shop in the neighborhood paid Max and his gang for the right to have their windows intact and their place not stink bomb. The illegal ones paid for the right to be criminals in Max's neighborhood. By 1908, Max had beaten a murder charge and did 6 months in Sing Sing for receiving stolen goods. He had his headquarters in Brooklyn and a candy shop right across the bridge from the Lower East Side. Max's reign was successful but short. On May 14, 1908, Max was shot 6 times by Louis Paggi, a.k.a. Louis the Lump, as he walked on the Bowery in Coney Island. Max's bodyguard, Sam Pistorich, a wrestler known as Voc Lewis or Cyclone Louis, was shot once in the head and also died. Max was guilty of being a new love interest of Carol Kelly, a showgirl Max had just met and who happened to be Louis the Lump's ex-girlfriend. Louis the Lump killed Max when he saw Max and Kelly together out of jealousy. Next man up was Zelig Lefkowitz, better known as Jack Zelig and later known as Big Jack Zelig. He was born May 13, 1888 in New York. He grew up in the filthy tenements on the Lower East Side, but he spent most of his time in the streets with the other kids, one of them Max Zerback. He began his criminal career as a child pickpocket in a gang of crazy Butch Arenstarff. Butch had a team of kids and even a dog who he trained to pickpockets that went into the streets of Manhattan every day, relieving people of their valuables. Jack would be arrested for trying to steal a stick pen off a man on the train when he was around 17, and he would be sent to Sing Sing for 2 years. And when he returned in the summer of 1908, he got involved in an ongoing feud between the men who still called themselves the Eastman Gang and 2 former Five Pointers, Chick Tricker and Jack Sirocco. One of the Jewish gangsters vying for the leadership of the Eastmans was a man named Abe Lewis. Jack had become a father before going away, and he was too old to pick pockets, so he went to Abe Lewis for help. Abe told him that he had a job for him: kill Chick Tricker. Jack drank himself up enough courage to head over to Chick's place. Jack lured Chick into a hallway, pulled his gun, aimed it at Chick, but he froze. He ran out and ran off with his family to Chicago. Chicago was no better for Jack. He was beaten to within an inch of his life by disgruntled gamblers, but he was able to escape before they could finish him off, and he moved back to the Lower East Side while his several skull fractures healed. His body healed, but he was changed forever. Now Jack had no problem giving a person a beating or a bullet. Jack had a gang of about 60 men, and they partook in the usual: robberies, extortion, murder, election day work for Tammany. But Jack's innovation was providing protection for the many illegal gambling houses that popped up in New York. In 1912, a gambler named Herman Beansy Rosenthal and his brand new gambling den was raided by a strong-arm squad. Beansy was upset. He had a partner to prevent this type of thing from happening. Lieutenant Charles Becker was part of the city's strong-arm squad created to stop gambling in the city by the mayor. But Becker used his position to extort gamblers for protection. Beansy told Becker that if he was raided, he would go to the press with all of this. Becker's hands were tied, though. When the mayor found out about Beansy's new place, he ordered it raided. It was, and Beansy kept his promise. He went to the police and the press. Becker and some of his gambling friends went to Jack's men and paid them to kill Beansy. On July 16, 1912, Beansy Rosenthal was gunned down in front of the Metropole Hotel by Harry Horowitz, known as Gyp the Blood, Lefty Louis Rosenberg, and Jacob Snyder, known as Whitey Lewis, all of them Jack's men. They would be arrested along with Becker. Jack was still out, and he was scraping money together to try to get them out. He was scheduled to take the witness stand, and he promised to tell the truth about what happened. He never got the opportunity. On October 5, 1912, Jack was shot as he sat on a trolley car by Philip Red Davis, a small-time crook and full-time drunk. When Red was arrested, he had a police department-issued pistol. Becker, Horowitz, Rosenberg, and Whitey Lewis were all sent to the electric chair. Benjamin Vine was known as Dopey because of a nasal condition that left him with puffy and droopy eyes. But Benny was no dope. He was the first real thinker in the gang, and he took the gang and turned them into hired goons for labor disputes. Working conditions for the average worker were horrible at that time. Tired of long hours and low wages and unsafe working conditions, many factories and plants began to unionize. When a factory boss needed a strike broken, Dopey's gang was there for a fee. And when strikers needed to keep scabs out, Dopey was there for a fee. But it wasn't all roses for Dopey. He was shot and stabbed several times on the job. He did a few months in Sing Sing for murder before being exonerated, and a few more for union busting. He would eventually retire around 1916 and live a regular life with his wife and family. The mid-teens saw the next generation of Jewish gangsters put on the shelf for a few years. Nathan Kid Dropper Kaplan, Jacob Little Auggie Organ, and Johnny Spanish were all doing time. No true leader would emerge until they got out. But it was also around this time that the men who would become the Jewish mob made their way onto the streets. Guys like Meyer Lansky, Abe Longy Swillman, a 10-year-old runaway named Benjamin Siegel, Samuel Red Levine, Louis Lepke Buckhalter, and Jacob Shapiro began to be the badass little boys terrorizing pushcart vendors, newsstands, and breaking into whatever they could. This would be the birth of the Buggenmeyer mob and the Lepke mob. I'm not sure if Buggenmeyer and Lepke and Gora were acquainted yet, but they would be in a few years. The biggest gambler in New York at the time was Arnold Rothstein. He was not yet a gangster. He was in the middle of growing his power, money, and political influence at that time. By the time the Roaring Twenties hit, he would be in a position to bankroll and mentor the young Jewish mob, teach them how to organize and become wealthy. We'll get back to AR in a few. The next would-be king was Nathan Kid Dropper Kaplan. Born on August 3, 1891, Nathan took to the streets young, and by the time he was 18, he was a labor goon working for Johnny Weller, known on the streets as Johnny Spanish. Johnny was Italian and Spanish mixed, and was actually more aligned with the rival Five Pointers than the Eastmans. In 1910, Johnny planned an attack on rival gangsters who stayed on Forsyth Street. On May 30th, Johnny and his gang executed that raid. Several gangsters were hit when the lead started flying. One of them tried to use a little girl as a shield. Johnny didn't care. He shot anyway, killing the girl but not the gangster behind her, and he fled town. Johnny stayed in Detroit for a few weeks but returned. He was charged with murder in the first degree and released on bond. When he came back to the streets of the Lower East Side, he found out that his girl was now Kaplan's girl. Enraged, he shot Kaplan as he stood on the street corner, and then he took his girlfriend to Long Island, tied her to a tree, and shot her in the abdomen after she refused his wedding proposal. Johnny went back on the run and was captured in March of 1911 and sentenced to 7 years in Sing Sing. Not long after Johnny took the train to Ossining, he was joined by his old pal, Kid Dropper. Kaplan had been convicted of burglary and sentenced to a stretch. He would be out in 1916, a year before Johnny. Johnny Spanish would be released in 1917, and he rejoined Kaplan. Apparently there was no love lost, who had become the biggest labor racketeer in the city. But the two men could not put all their differences behind them, and they fell out again. Johnny started his own gang and became a major competitor to Kaplan. On July 29, 1919, Kaplan shot Johnny Spanish twice in the chest as he entered the restaurant on 2nd Avenue. This left Nathan Kid Dropper Kaplan as the boss of the Lower East Side. He would remain unchallenged until 1921, when another veteran of the labor wars, Jacob Organ, known as Little Auggie, returned from Sing Sing. Little Auggie went back to the Dopey Benny days, and he was his gun holder. As a teen, he formed his own gang of terrorists who called themselves the Little Augies. In 1919, he was sent away for 2 years on a parole violation from a previous case. When he got back, Little Auggie reestablished his presence in labor racketeering. This often put the Kaplan gang and the Little Auggie gang in direct conflict. When the factory hired Kaplan to break a strike and the union hired Auggie to fight the strike breakers, the battles were epic. Rumor has it that it was Kaplan who put the scar on Augie's cheek with a paring knife, and Auggie who put a slug in Kaplan's leg later in response. The men under Auggie were young, ambitious, and violent. Among them, Jacob Shapiro, known as Gora, Louis Buckhalter, known as Lepke, a young Ben Siegel, who at this time was still just an all-around crook, but was seen as one of the best getaway drivers in New York, even though he was still a teenager. Mendy Weiss, we'll get back to Mendy in a few, and Harry Big Greenie Greenberg, and possibly others like Red Levine and Longies Willman. I can't confirm, but they were all in the same circle, so it's possible. The beef between the two gangs raged until August 1st, 1923. Gora, Lepke, and a few other Augies were standing on the corner of Essex and Suffolk when a touring car rolled by. Two men stuck guns out the window and shots rang out. The lead shower sent the gang running for cover. When the smoke cleared, Gora and William Wessinger, an innocent bystander, laid on the ground. Gora had been shot in the chin and the belly. Wessinger was shot in the head, but he would survive. Lepke and the others piled Gora into a car and took him to postgraduate hospital, dropped him off, and left. Gora was arrested and held as a material witness. The Augies used this to get Kaplan once and for all. Gora went to the police and told them that it was Kaplan who shot them. Kid Dropper and his gang were arrested. On August 28, 1923, Gora took the stand at the Essex courthouse and recanted his statement. The charges were dropped and Kaplan walked. He was scheduled to appear in an uptown court and was escorted by 2 police officers. He kissed his wife and climbed into the backseat of a taxi. As he did, Louis Cohen pushed his way through the crowd and made his way to the back of the taxi. He pulled a revolver and squeezed off 3 rounds before Kaplan's wife and the police took him to the ground. Kaplan was hit twice. He died on the scene. Cohen was arrested and sentenced to 25 years. Little Auggie was top dog now. and it stayed that way for a few years. During those years, over in Brooklyn, a family of tough guys was making a bad name for themselves. Joe, Hyman, and Lewis, known as Pretty, the Ambergs. The Ambergs hail from Williamsburg, and Joe, the oldest, had been involved in all types of criminal activity since the mid-teens and had the bullet, knife wounds, and rap sheet to prove it. His brother Pretty was your average psychopath, violent and sadistic. Pretty was just a mean person who enjoyed hurting people and loved being feared. Hyman was the baby, but he was just as ruthless and the first of the family to go. In 1925, Hyman was in the tombs for murder and facing the electric chair. Joe and Pretty were both in jail, so with the help of the oldest brother, Oscar, guns were tossed over the wall. The escape attempt would fail, and instead of going to the electric chair, Hyman ended it himself with a bullet. The Ambergs were so bad, their own mother, after they were gone, changed her name so she wouldn't be associated with them. So like I said, Williamsburg and the Lower East Side were pretty much the same neighborhood, separated by a river. During the 1920s, Joey and Pretty made their presence felt in both. Arnold Rothstein entered the bootlegging business in 1923, and he needed men to protect the shipments. Meyer, Ben, Lepke, Gura all moonlighted for Rothstein between strikes for Little Auggie. Arnold polished these diamonds in the rough and taught them how to see the big picture. He showed them that political bull could be as dangerous as a pistol and taught them how to be criminal businessmen and not just muscle. Ben and Meyer and some of the Lepke gang were not only protecting bull shipments, they were hijacking shipments from bootleggers and selling it back to them or to others looking for a bargain. Many bootleggers found out that the best way to make sure that they didn't hijack their shipment was to pay them to protect them. By 1927, the pups had grown up and were ready to be the kings of the jungle, but the current king was still in power. That summer, Auggie was hired to end a strike in Brooklyn for $50,000. Gora and Lepke, with their new insight from Rothstein, saw the bigger picture. They wanted to play both sides, draw the strike out, and make 10 times as much. Little Auggie rejected the deal. On top of that, he gave the job and the 50 grand to Legs Diamond and his gang. To Lepke and Gora, the future was now. On October 16th, Little Auggie left his home to meet with Legs Diamond. As they walked down Norfolk Street, a car driven by Ben Siegel containing Lepke and Gora pulled slowly behind them, and the pair hopped out. They walked up behind Auggie and Legs and put one bullet into the back of Little Augie's head and one in the Legs' belly just in case. They hopped into the car and pulled off. Lepke and Gora were arrested, but with no witnesses and no evidence, they were let go. Arnold Rothstein didn't stay in the booze business long. By 1926, he had moved on to bigger and better things and was possibly the largest importer of heroin in America. All the young Jewish mob became drug dealers. Ben and Meyer had their headquarters in a garage where they repaired cars and rented them out as taxis. The taxi service was a great way to move product around the city. What cop was going to stop a cab with an old lady or a mother and her child in the back seat? 1928 will mark the end of one legendary Jewish gangster and the rise of another. On November 7, 1928, Arnold Rothstein stumbled out of room 349 at the Park Sheraton Hotel with a bullet in his gut. He was taken to the hospital where he died the next day. Up in the Bronx, another legend was being made. Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, had been working as a bouncer for Legs Diamond's beer operation in the Bronx. While Legs was recovering from a bullet in his belly, courtesy of Lepke and Gora, Dutch and his partner Joey Noy decided that it was time to break away from Diamond. They started pushing their beer to Diamond's customers and taking over his territory in the Bronx. When Diamond found out, he was out for blood or money. They agreed on money. Dutch and Noy agreed to pay Jack off, but Jack pulled a double cross and Noy was killed. Jack left town and headed to the Catskills, and Dutch became the beer baron of the Bronx. Dutch built himself an army of really bad men. The Weinberg brothers, Bo and George, Lulu Rosenkrantz, Abe Landau, and the ultra-violent Irishman, Vince Cole. Dutch was cordial and on good terms with the Jewish gangsters from downtown, and he was considered an ally. Over in Brownsville, Brooklyn, 3 young street toughs were looking for a way into the big time. Abe Rellis, who took the name Kid Twist after Max Zerback, Martin Goldstein, known to his friends as Buck and to the world as Bugsy, and Harry Strauss, known as Pep and Big Harry, but better known as Pittsburgh Phil. At the time, they were just all-purpose criminals, armed robbery, burglary, union busting, stuff like that. In 1928, Abe was sent away for shooting a 17-year-old girl in the chest after she refused to sell her body and give him the money. I think they have a word for that. Abe was sent up for 2 years. While he was away, he made contacts with men associated with the Bug and Meyer gang. When he got out in 1930, he had connections and plans. Jack Drucker had come up with Lepke and Gora under Little Auggie and was now in the slot machine business. And he and a few partners ran the Triangle firm. Slot machines were all the rage. Gangsters like Frank Costello were making millions of dollars a year, and Abe wanted in. Through his new connections, he arranged to meet Drucker and get a few machines to start with. Abe, Pep, and Bugsy began to put slot machines in stores and restaurants in Brownsville. This was a problem. Meyer and Irvin Shapiro were Jewish gangsters, but not in the Lepke, Gora, Bug, and Meyer circle. In fact, they had dealings with Legs Diamond and the Catskills. While Abe was away, the Shapiro brothers, Meyer and Irving, had made their presence known in Brownsville. The Shapiros had made money through floating crap games, brothels, and slot machines, and considered Brownsville theirs. They were not keen on competition. To make things more interesting, there was a love triangle between Abe, his girlfriend Rose, and Meyer Shapiro. It all became very personal, and a war broke out. Abe reached out to Happy Mayone, an Italian gangster from Ocean Hill, and asked for his help taking on the Shapiros. In return, they would split the graft from Brownsville to Ocean Hill. In June of 1930, the bullets began to fly, both ways. Abe and Meyer were both shot by each other on separate occasions, and Bugsy Goldstein almost had his nose blown off his face in one attack. But slowly, the combination, as they called themselves, began to pick off the Shapiro men. In July of 31, Abe Rellis and Frank Abendondo killed Irvin Shapiro inside the vestibule of the Shapiro family home. Meyer would follow in September, killed by a Lepke man in Manhattan. Abe, Pep, and Bugsy were in the big leagues now. Their timing couldn't have been better. At this time, things were happening in the Italian underworld that would affect the Jewish mob and organized crime on the whole. Salvatore Maranzano had become the boss of the Mafia in New York and for the most part in the U.S. after his war with Joe the Boss Masseria. He was looking to get rid of anyone who he saw as a threat, and on that list was Charlie Lucky, his pal Meyer Lansky, and Dutch Schultz. On September 10, 1931, Bo Weinberg, on loan from the Dutch Schultz mob, Red Levine from the Bug and Meyer gang, and two other Jewish gangsters entered Maranzano's office in the Grand Central Building disguised as federal agents. After Maranzano was marked by Charlie's pal Tommy Lucchese, who worked in the office, he was taken to another office where he was stabbed several times and shot twice. This put Charlie in the top seat in the Italian mob. He went around the country pitching his National Syndicate. Meyer Lansky accompanied him on his tour. While Charlie met with the Italians, Meyer met with the Jewish gangsters. Jake Guzik in Chicago, the Bernsteins and their Purple Gang in Detroit, Max Boo Boo Hoff and Nick Rosen in Philly, among others. The Jewish side of the syndicate was not as organized as the Italians, with their strict hierarchy, no boss, underboss, capo, soldier structure like that. They were more loose, but if Lucky was recognized as the boss of bosses among Italians, his counterpart would be Lepke. By 1931, Lepke had almost total control over labor in the garment district. They were still strikebreakers, but Lepke and Gora had infiltrated unions and businesses and controlled everything from the inside now. They had the power to call a strike at any time that would shut the industry down and cost millions. He was pulling in tens of millions of dollars a year during the Depression from labor alone. He also inherited Arnold Rothstein's drug connections and was a major importer and dealer of heroin. At this point, the Bug and Meyer gang and the Lepke mob were one and the same, like a cartel. If you had a problem with one, you had a problem with them all. On November 11, 1931, Hyman Holtz, Gora Shapiro, Louis Krantz, Ben Siegel, Philip Kovic, Harry Teitelbaum, Joe Rosen, Harry Big Greenie Greenberg, and Louis Lepke were arrested at the Hotel Franconia. They were charged with several millions of dollars worth of vandalism in a recent garment trade strike. The men said that they were there visiting their sick friend Lepke. Now, I know you guys have seen the photo before where Lepke has the eye patch. I know when I first saw this picture as a kid, I wondered what happened to his eye. It had to be some great story of a fight behind this injury. Well, it turns out this was an injury from a pea shooter, a spitball. I don't know the particulars, but I assume that it was some striker using a pea shooter as a weapon, using hard peas or small stones against strikebreakers, and not a practical joke gone bad. But we'll never know. The dope game was the new prohibition boom, but easier to smuggle and transport, and paid higher dividends than booze. $1 million in a suitcase. Lepke was the financial backer for the tens of millions of dollars of heroin and raw opium imported from China. Hyman Curly Holt, who went back to Little Auggie with Lepke and Gora, went to Europe to set up a smuggling operation for Lepke. By 1932, Everyone associated with Lepke was moving junk. Ben and Meyer, and the Brownsville crew, who were arrested on May 28, 1932, and charged with possession of narcotics. The drug game brought its own set of problems. Now, just because you were a Jewish gangster in New York didn't mean that you were part of them. And a few guys would find this out over the next few years. The Wagner brothers, Abe and Al, were Jewish drug dealers from the Lower East Side who didn't get their supply from Lepke and his boys. They were competition. They were warned to stay out of the business, but they refused, even after being sent several warnings in the form of hot lead through Al's car door one night. A few days later, the brothers had to sit down with Ben and two others. One of them was Charlie the Bug Workman. After the meeting, Ben and his guys left. A few hours later, they returned. This time they kicked the door in and sprayed the room with gunfire. Abe Wagner was able to return fire. Workman was hit in the shoulder before they made their escape. Al was hit in the head and wouldn't make it. Abe fled town and went to St. Paul, Minnesota. Once word got back that he was in St. Paul, a phone call was made to the Purple Gang and the problem was solved in a hail of bullets in February 1932. By this time, Abe Relis was spending a lot of time with Ben Siegel. Even though they were the same age, Ben being born a few months before Abe, Ben was a veteran. He had been with all the top guys in the underworld since he was a teenager, and he was showing Abe, Pep, and the other Bugsy the ropes. Now, Pretty Amberg made some of his money burglarizing lofts, and his specialty was fur warehouses. He had planned his next job and picked Vincent Baccia up from his home, and they headed over to the Bug&Meyer garage at 29 Avenue C to pick up a car for the job. Bug&Meyer man Harry Buckbinder ran the garage, and when he told Pretty and Vincent that he didn't have anything for them, an argument between Baccia and Buckbinder broke out, which resulted in Baccia shooting Harry twice in the chest and killing him on the spot. Harry Buckbinder went a long way back with Bug&Meyer, so he would have to be avenged. Vincent went to hide in Newark, New Jersey. When Ben found out, he headed to Newark with a team of killers from your worst nightmares. Besides himself, Abe Relis, Pep Strauss, and Pretty Amberg, at least, accompanied him to the hotel. After gaining entry, they forced Vincent to call his brother Anthony and tell him to come to Newark. Anthony Baccia dropped his plans, picked up his friend Andrew Fabrizio, and headed to rescue his brother. All three of their mutilated bodies will be found the next day in two different states. All three men died in the most brutal of fashions, hog-tied, beaten, stabbed, and stomped to death by guys who gained great pleasure by inflicting the most pain possible. Not sure if Pretty taught it to Pep or he taught it to Pretty, but over the next few years, both will perfect the hog-tying method of execution into a science. If a body popped up in Brooklyn, trussed up as they called it, it was a good chance it was Pep or Pretty. They both used it as sort of a calling card, and the only way you could tell who done it was that Pretty usually stuffed his victims in the laundry bags. Andrew Fabrizio had a brother who was a made man, and he had some pull in the Italian Mafia, and he was not happy. His name was Anthony Fabrizio, known on the streets as Tony the Wop. On November 10, 1932, Ben and 7 of his pals were playing cards at 547 Grand Street, the gang's headquarters. Someone lowered a bomb down the chimney and it exploded. Ben was hit with a large chunk of concrete and knocked unconscious. Also injured were Red Levine and Big Greenie Greenberg. They were all taken to the hospital. While Ben lay in a coma, Fabrizio's men tried to finish him off, but the rest of the gang came and removed him from the hospital and put him into a private one. Tony the Watt was in hiding at his family home when someone knocked loudly on the door. Anthony's father answered it and found 4 men in the hallway who said that they were detectives and needed to speak to Tony. When Tony got out in the hallway, he found Gora Shapiro, Pretty Amberg, and 2 others. Not sure, but take your pick. Red Levine, Mendy Weiss, Charlie the Bug Workman, Abe, Pep, not sure. But Pretty and Gora were there. When the 4 men walked out of the building and back into their waiting car, they'd left Tony Fabrizio's mother screaming and crying, and Tony stretched out on the floor with 3 slugs in his chest. As early as 1932, the papers began to refer to the Jewish mob as a murder-for-hire unit. But it wasn't that simple. It was more like, if you had a beef with one member, it would be other members that you never met before that would come kill you. No money was exchanged, with a few exceptions. It was more like they had each other's back in the beef. But it was more than that. They were more than business partners. They shared a cultural background. They went to each other's weddings, kids' bar mitzvahs, and on vacation with their families together. Lepke, being a labor racketeer, sometimes needed people killed, some of whom were not criminals, and he kept a team of killers on staff who he paid $200 a week and bonuses for this type of work. His staff consisted of Mendy Weiss, a former taxi driver and labor goon, He worked in Lepke's narcotic business as well, and he was a stone killer. Charlie the Bug Workman, a nonchalant killer who was eager to kill for Lepke, especially big-time guys. He liked to rob them after he shot them and make a few bucks on top of the bonus from Lepke. Red Levine was an enigma, a deeply religious man who would not kill on the Sabbath if he could help it, and he wore a yarmulke under his fedora. When you read about Red Levine saying that Charlie the Bug took all the work, it was this time when they all worked for Lepke that he was talking about. Harry Big Greenie Greenberg was an illegal immigrant from Poland. Very big, very strong, very violent, not too bright. Big Greenie had been a strikebreaker for Lepke for years. Ali Tic-Toc Tannenbaum, a kid from the Catskills who met the guys while the guys were on vacation at his family resort. Jacob Drucker, like we talked about earlier, had been with Lepke and Gora since the 20s, and his family farm in the Catskills would be the graveyard used for the gang for about 10 years. One of the ways that the Bug and Meyer gang made their money was escorting illegal booze shipments, like I talked about earlier. It was cheaper to pay them than to have your shipments hijacked. Well, in 1933, when Prohibition was on its way out, one of their biggest clients, Irving Wexler, who was known as Waxy Gordon, and he went back to the days of Dopey Benny on the Lower East Side. He was the man who talked Arnold Rothstein into going into the liquor business back in '23 and became one of AR's best drug customers when he began that business. He was not part of the Jewish mob, but he used the Bug and Meyer gang to escort his shipments. In 1933, Waxy informed Ben and Meyer that he would no longer be needing his services. Booze was about to be legal. If you hijacked a shipment, that was the law's problem. Now that's one reason. The other could be that Waxy was also in the drug business, and this beef could stem from that. Anyway, Ben decided to go to war. Not really. They made short work of Waxy's gang, killing about 10 of his men in little over a month, including 2 in one day in 2 different states. Meyer finished off Waxy with a plan more Machiavelli than Sun Tzu. He gave the feds information that got Waxy sent away to prison for tax evasion. This was a team effort. Everyone took part. The Lepke Gora gang, Bug and Meyer crew, and the Brownsville boys. The machine was running smoothly, but Lepke and Dutch were getting too big for their own good and became victims of their own success. They were named as 2 of the biggest crooks in New York, and Thomas Dewey was assigned the task of taking them down. He went after Dutch first, with the tax evasion charge that Dutch beat in 1935. On July 19, 1935, Dewey took his oath to become Deputy District Attorney and formally launched his crusade to destroy organized crime in New York State. For years, reform groups had waged a holy war against the vice, particularly gambling and prostitution, to little or no effect. Dewey made it clear that this was no purity drive to please the clergy or a drive to expose political corruption. He told a reporter that his objective was to stamp out as far as possible organized crime and racketeering of all kinds and find any connection between these crimes and law enforcement officials. At the top of Dewey's list, Lepke and Gora, Dutch Schultz, Cyril Terranova, Oni Madden, and Charles Toot Herbert. Dewey had already come after Schultz in the tax evasion case that ended in acquittal, but now he was coming after Dutch for racketeering. On top of the Dewey situation, 1935 would be a very turbulent year for the Jewish mob. 2 things would happen that would lead to the death of 3 of the Jewish mobsters. The first was Thomas Dewey, now appointed by the governor of New York to take down Dutch and the rest of the mob, announced new charges against Dutch and now Lepke. Dutch came to Lepke with the idea to kill Dewey. Lepke took it to Charlie Lucky and the rest of the syndicate, and they vetoed the idea, but Dutch decided that he would take care of Dewey himself. The other incident was when Joey Amberg borrowed money from High Kastner, a loan shark who was friends with the Brownsville boys and had money on the streets for Albert Anastasia. Instead of paying High back, Joey and his boys killed him, stuffed him in a sack and dumped him in the sewer, hoping the body would wash out to sea. Instead, it washed up on the South Jamaica beach. Albert Anastasia was livid. He called for Joey's head. Joey had been a longtime friend of Ben Siegel, the Lepke crew, and was business partners with Ben and Joe Adonis. Ben and Joe argued on his behalf, but eventually Albert won. On September 30th, 1935, Joe Amberg drove into a garage owned by Pep Strauss. As he got out the car with Morris Kessler, his bodyguard, they were approached by 2 men dressed like mechanics. They were lined up against the wall, and shots rang out. Blast from a shotgun almost cut Joey in half. Kessler was hit in the back with 4 bullets. The shooters were Happy Mayone and Philip Mangano. On October 12th, Frankie Teitelbaum, Joey's pal and one of High's killers, was found stuffed in a suitcase. under a bridge in Brooklyn. This didn't sit well with Pretty, and he came to Brownsville and threatened Pep Strauss that he was going to kill him and anyone else involved in his brother's death. Pep took this to Albert, and Pretty's ticket was punched. Pretty was in the window. He was a problem. He was a loose cannon on the streets that had to be dealt with. Him being one of them, he knew where they hung out and how they operated. So the Jewish mob stayed off the streets until a Pretty issue was settled. Pretty was partnered with Red Levine in a loan sharking operation in Williamsburg, but he couldn't set Pretty up. But Mendy Weiss went a long way back with Pretty, and Pretty trusted him. Mendy agreed to set up his old pal. Mendy invited Pretty to a restaurant in Williamsburg to talk. Pretty accepted. Pretty and Mendy arrived at the restaurant a little after midnight on October 23, 1935. Mendy invited Pretty to the kitchen for a drink. When he walked in, Pretty was met by Red Levine, Albert Anastasia, and Pep Strauss holding a fire axe. Pretty was beaten and hacked to death. His body was placed in a stolen car and set on fire. He would be found around 4 a.m. By now, Dutch was no longer a member of the inner circle of the Jewish mob. He had broken ties after a disagreement that had nothing to do with the Dewey case a while back. While Dutch was fighting his tax case, Charlie Lucky and Lepke began to work with the man who would succeed Dutch if he went to prison, Bo Weinberg. When Dutch beat his case, he didn't like the fact that Bo was working behind his back. On September 9, 1935, Bo Weinberg kissed his wife, left the hotel they were staying at, and was never seen again. On top of his threats to Dewey, this sealed Dutch's fate. While Pretty's body was still smoldering in Brooklyn, Mendy was given another assignment: kill Dutch Schultz. At around 10 p.m. that night, Mendy and Charlie the Bug Workman entered the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, walked to the back dining area and opened fire on Abe Landau, Abba Berman, and Lulu Rosencrantz. Charlie the Bug noticed that Dutch wasn't among the bleeding men. He kicked the bathroom door and found the Dutchman holding his pride and joy, and he put one slug into his side before barely escaping the Dutchman's bleeding men hot on his heels. While Dutch was dying in New Jersey, his lieutenant Marty Crompier was in the Hollywood barbershop at 47th and Broadway. When he stepped out the chair, Pep Strauss and Happy Mayone entered the barbershop. Pep fired once in the air and 3 times into Marty, and one into his pal Sammy Gold, before disappearing into the train station. Marty would make it. Dutch would not. The thing about Pretty and Dutch is that they were at odds with each other when they were both killed. Dutch was looking to open a Shylock in Pretty's area of downtown Brooklyn, and Pretty had told Dutch that he would cut his heart out if he stepped into Brooklyn. They had a long-standing feud that stemmed back to when Pretty worked for Dutch as muscle during his war with Vincent Cole. Chink Sherman was a Jewish gangster who operated outside the established Jewish mob too. He was a flashy drug dealer who worked for Waxy Gordon. He survived the purge of Waxy's gang and was now an independent dealer. He and Dutch Schultz had a long-time feud too. This boiled over to them both being nearly killed in a fight in the Club Abbey in 1931. Dutch was shot and Chink was stabbed in the face and neck with a broken bottle. They both barely survived. Whether he did something in particular to get on the wrong side of the Jewish mob or whether he was always on the hit list, I don't know. But his naked corpse was found bullet-ridden and beaten in a shallow grave covered in lime on a family farm of Jack Drucker in November 1935, a few weeks after Dutch was rubbed out. With Dutch out the way, Dewey switched his attention to Charlie Lucky, who he got put away on a prostitution rap in 1936. Lepke and Gura were next, but Lepke wasn't taking any chances. Before the indictments came down, he told everyone who Dewey could use against him to get out of New York for their own protection. Ben moved to L.A., Meyer moved to Florida, and Big Greenie Greenberg was deported back to Poland. Those who chose to stay were not given a second warning. In December 1936, Gura and Lepke were found guilty of union racketeering. They infiltrated the unions and ownership and were making $10 million a year from the rabbit fur industry, leaving bodies along the way. They were given a $20,000 bail and were released until sentencing. They both jumped bail and went on the lam. In March of '37, they will both be sentenced in absentia to 2 years in prison. They didn't run far. Gura stayed in New York and New Jersey, and Lepke was in Brooklyn the whole time, under the protection of Albert Anastasia. Abe Rellis was put in charge of taking care of him, taking him for late-night rides, and making sure that he wasn't lonely by bringing over young ladies to keep him company. Anyone who wanted to speak to Lepke had to come to Saratoga and Livonia and Brownsville, Midnight Rose's candy shop, the gang's headquarters. And Abe would either relay the message or take the person to Lepke's hideout to meet with him personally. So like I said, the guys were not paid for murders except for the guys Lepke kept on retainer. Well, while he was on the run, he put the Brownsville boys, Albert Anastasia, and Happy Mayone and his gang on retainer too. Over the next 4 years, most of the murders they committed were to protect Lepke. Irvin Ashkenash was the first to find out how serious Lepke was. Ashkenash was a former labor leader who had some dirt on Lepke that Dewey could use. In the early 30s, he did a bid for the attempted murder of one of Lepke's men. When he returned, he retired from the garment district and started a taxi service. In November 1936, he was hired by Lepke man Ali Tic-Toc Tannenbaum to drive him, Abe Pretty Levine, a small-time member of the Brownsville crew, and Jack Drucker from the city to the Paramount Hotel in the Catskills. When they arrived, Tic-Toc, Drucker, and the other Pretty pulled guns, shot him 16 times, and left his body outside the hotel entrance. In the fall of 1936, Joseph Rosen returned to Brooklyn after Lepke paid him to leave. Rosen was still sore at Lepke for driving him out of his trucking business, and he was talking to Dewey. When Lepke found out, Rosen was visited by Mendy Weiss and Pep Strauss on the morning of September 13th. They walked into his candy store and put 15 bullets into him while he was placing magazines on the shelf and walked out. In December of 1936, Gura Shapiro, tired of running, turned himself in to the police, and he was sent to Sing Sing to do his time. In 1937, the slightest hint that you were talking to Dewey could get you killed. George Whitey Rudnick had been a longtime pal of Abe Rellis. He was a burglar and a heroin addict who hung around sometimes but was not part of the gang and really didn't know much. In May of 1937, Whitey was arrested for burglary. After he was released, he was seen by Pep Strauss coming out of the courthouse. Pep thought that he might be talking to Dewey, and it was decided that he would be taken care of. On May 25th, he was found garroted, stabbed 64 times with an ice pick, and hacked in the forehead with a meat cleaver in an abandoned car in Brooklyn. Sam Silverman was 25 years old when he was arrested for robbery and released. The next day, his partner, Nathan Kaufman, was arrested. Silverman had something on Lepke, and they thought he might be squealing, but he wasn't. It didn't matter. On July 16th, his body was found beaten, stabbed, shot, and trussed up in a stolen car in Flatbush, Brooklyn. On the night before Thanksgiving in 1937, Harry Millman, the last of the Purple Gang, was gunned down in Detroit by Pep Strauss and Harry Mayone. This was on the orders of the Italian mob in Detroit. Besides the fact they couldn't get the job done themselves, Harry was a Jew, so a Jew should do the killing, was their reasoning. In December 1937, Lepke was hit with a federal narcotics charge. The feds said that he was the head of an international drug smuggling operation. Mendy Weiss was also charged, as well as several other Lepke men. 1938 was a slow year for the Jewish mob. Not too much action in New York, but in Los Angeles, Ben Siegel was becoming a force. He organized the film unions and used his reputation as a gangster to shake down big-time Hollywood stars. He lived in a mansion in the Hollywood Hills and had a young Jewish hood named Mickey Cohen under his wing. Lepke resumed his purge of witnesses in 1939. Morris Diamond was a business manager for the Teamsters Local 138. He made the mistake of giving info to Dewey about Lepke's shakedowns. On May 25th, he was shot 5 times at 68th and 18th Avenue as he walked from his home. 5 days later, on June 1st, the body of Morris Carollo, a longtime dope man, was found way down in Loch Sheldrake in the Catskills. He had been beaten and stabbed. His partners were arrested in Philly a few months prior and he was on the run. He was silenced because he knew too much about the drug operation. I'm not sure about the particulars of his death, but it's obvious he got well acquainted with Pep Strauss. Irving Penn was a music publishing executive and a guy who had nothing to do with the rackets. Unfortunately for him, he resembled Philip Orlovsky, a man who was a witness in Lepke's case. He also lived in the same building in the Bronx. He was shot and killed in front of the building on July 25th, 1939, by 4 men who sped off in a car that was found a few blocks away. After hiding out for almost 3 years, in July 1939, Lepke was told that a deal had been made with the feds. His mob pals told him that if he turned himself into FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, he would only have to face the federal narcotics charges and not the antitrust charges that Dewey had waiting for him. He surrendered to J. Edgar Hoover on July 29, 1939. As soon as he got in the car, he found out that he had been lied to. Not only was he going to be facing federal charges, but after the feds were done with him, he would be turned over to Dewey. Sometime in 1938, Harry Big Greenie Greenberg made his way back from Poland to Canada and back into the U.S. He sent a letter to Lepke saying he needed money and that Lepke better not forget him, or else. Lepke took the or else as meaning Greenie would go to Dewey. Lepke sent men after him, but by the time they got there, he was gone. He popped up in LA a few weeks later. When Ben Siegel found out about this, he let Lepke know that he would handle it himself. On November 22nd, 1939, Ben shot and killed Big Greenie Greenberg as he sat in his car outside of his house. Danny Fields had gone a long way back with the whole gang. It was his house that Charlie the Buck Workman went to after the Dutch Schultz hit the hideout. In 1938, he caught a case, and Lepke didn't trust that he would keep his mouth shut. On January 29th, Danny was standing on Lewis Street between Broome and Grand on the Lower East Side with Lewis Cohen, the same Lewis Cohen who shot Nathan Kidd Dropper Kaplan back in 1923. He had been released in 1937 and was welcomed back into the gang. As they walked, a car pulled alongside. 3 men got out and shots rang out. Danny was hit several times in the chest and fell to the ground dead. Cohen put up a fight. He pulled his own gun and fired 3 times as he retreated. He was dropped by a bullet in the neck. Mendy Weiss and the 2 other men got back into the car and pulled off. Lewis Cohen was not the intended target. He had been warned to stay away from Danny, but he didn't listen, and it cost him. In 1940, the lid was blown off the whole thing. In January, Abe Rellis and Bugsy Goldstein were arrested and charged for a murder they committed back in 1933. A small-time thief named Red Albert. Normally, these guys wouldn't have been shaken, but this was different. The new Brooklyn DA had 2 of Abe's underlings in his custody, and they were willing to talk. And they knew a lot. Too much. Abe realized that if he didn't start talking, someone would, and he would have to face the electric chair. After a visit from his wife, he sent a message to Brooklyn DA William O'Dwyer that he was ready to talk. This shook up the whole gang. Abe knew who got killed, who killed them, why, and where the bodies were. He spilled the beans on everything. He told about the murders him and his gang committed and the murders that Lepke's guys did. And he told about Lepke's purge of anyone who could testify against him. Abe told of the murder of Dutch Schultz, and Charlie the Buck Workman and Allie Tic-Toc Tannenbaum were arrested. Charlie was sent to New Jersey, where he pleaded guilty to shooting the Dutchman and was sentenced to life in prison. Tic-Toc was charged with the murder of Irvin Ashkenaz and turned Stooley to escape the electric chair. Together, their testimonies sank the Jewish mob. Abe gave the testimony that would send his childhood friends, Pep Strauss and Bugsy Goldstein, to the electric chair. They were convicted of killing a small-time gambler named Irving Puggy Feinstein in 1939, a murder that took place in Abe's house and one that he took part in. Puggy's death was ordered by Vince Mangano and carried out by the boys on orders from Albert Anastasia. Pep and Bugsy were put to death on June 14, 1941. Abe and Tic-Toc flew to L.A. and told the grand jury what they knew about the murder of Big Greenie Greenberg, and Ben Siegel was arrested. Abe told of the Joe Rosen murder in 1936. He named Pep and Mendy as the shooters, Louis Capone for planning it, and Lepke for ordering it. Lepke was brought back from Leavenworth and stood trial for the murder. Louis Capone was arrested, and Mendy, who had turned himself in on a narcotics charge, was brought back from Sing Sing. The stool pigeons were housed on the 5th floor of the Half Moon Hotel on Coney Island under heavy guard. On November 11, 1941, Abe's wife came to visit him. The next day, he was scheduled to talk to a grand jury about Albert Anastasia and the killing of Morris Diamond. On the morning of November 12th, Abe was found dead on the 1st floor roof after falling or being thrown from his 5th floor room. The police investigation ruled that Abe was trying to escape and accidentally fell to his death. The charges against Anastasia went away. Ben was released in L.A., but it was too late for Mendy and Lepke. They would be found guilty of conspiring to and murdering Joseph Rosen. On February 19, 1941, Happy Mayon and Frank the Dasher Abendando had their last meals and took the walk to the electric chair in Sing Sing. The testimony Abe gave on the murder of George Whitey Rudnick and their involvement sank their case. After several appeals, Mendy Weiss, Louis Capone, and Louis Lepke took the same walk and were executed on March 4, 1944. Jacob Drucker would stay on the run until he was captured in 1944 in Wilmington, Delaware. He was charged with 5 murders that happened in the Catskills in or around Loch Sheldrake, where his family farm was. Chink Sherman, Irvin Ashkenaz, Morris Carlo, Walter Sage, a former member of the Brownsville crew, killed by Drucker and Pep Strauss in 1937 and dumped into a lake tied to a slot machine, and Hyman Euron, a dress manufacturer that Lepke thought was going to squeal. Hyman was walked out of a restaurant in front of his wife while on vacation in the Catskills by Pep Strauss. He was beaten, stabbed, and buried in lime on the Drucker farm. Drucker was sentenced to 25 to life for the murder of Walter Sage and was not tried for the others. On June 9, 1947, Gora Shapiro died of a heart attack while in prison. One of the last men standing, Ben Siegel, would expand his operation from LA to Las Vegas and open the Flamingo Hotel and Casino. the first of many luxury casinos in Las Vegas. On June 20th, 1947, Ben Siegel was gunned down as he read a newspaper in the living room of his girlfriend Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion. Meyer Lansky outlived them all and would be one of the last Jewish mob to pass. He did so January 15th, 1983, of a heart attack. The Lepke, Buggenmeyer, Brownsville gangsters would be the last generation of Jewish organized crime. There would still be Jewish gangsters, but they would be associates of an Italian family or worked with their permission, never to the extent that it was. Jewish gangsters still operated in the garment district, the unions, narcotics, and the numbers, but it was not like it was when Lepke ran the show. And that, my friends, is the skinny on the Jewish mob. I hope you guys enjoyed the story as much as I enjoyed telling it. I hope you learned some things that you didn't know about the whole Jewish mob. So if you're new here and you like the way we do things over here at A Few Bad Men, you want to join the gang, first thing you got to do is you got to bump off that subscribe button. That's the first thing you got to do. Second thing you got to do is you got to break that thumb. Let them know we're not playing. Ring that bell, set it for all notifications. If you want to slide a little envelope upstairs to the boss, the PayPal link is in the description. If you want to see the uncut videos with all the bodies and the gory stuff I can't show you, you got to go get yourself a YouTube membership or go to the Patreon and subscribe over there. All right. So people have been asking me, how come the videos have been taking longer? It's a few things. First of all, I've been doing, the last few stories I've been doing, I've had a lot of information that I have to go through and sort out. And I don't want to split the videos up. I'd rather them be one long video than to split them up because the algorithm works better when you do it one video. Two is, I still got to work. I'm doing all this and I'm still working because, YouTube, it seems like the algorithm is not sending notifications to everyone. Even my son, who was the first subscriber, said he hasn't had a notification in months. So it's like it's just you guys who tune in every month or every video to watch. So I'm happy with that and I'm okay with that. But the videos will take a little longer because I'm trying to get them. I want to make sure that I can get the whole story done in one video. All right. So like I said, I'm going to be doing the videos over that had gotten taken down. The Monk Eastman, I took down Big Jack Zelig, Waxy Gordon, Chink Sherman. I'm going to redo those videos and post them up so I can fill in this whole Jewish mob story for the channel. All right. So listen, this has been A Few Bad Men. Keep your nose clean and don't take any wooden nickels. I see you in the funnies.